The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin, which you can read for free at the Anarchist Library. Preface. One of the current objections to communism and socialism altogether is that the idea is so old and yet it could never be realized. Schemes of ideal states haunted the thinkers of ancient Greece. Later, the early Christians joined in communist groups. Centuries later, large communist brotherhoods came into existence during the Reform movement. Then, the same ideals were revived during the Great English and French Revolutions, and finally, quite lately, in 1848, a revolution inspired, to a great extent with socialist ideals, took place in France. And yet, you see, we are told, how far away is still the realization of your schemes? Don't you think that there is some fundamental error in your understanding of human nature and its needs? At first sight, this objection seems serious. However, the moment we consider human history more attentively, it loses its strength. We see, first, that hundreds of millions of men have succeeded in maintaining amongst themselves, in their village communities, for many hundreds of years, one of the main elements of socialism, this common ownership of the chief instrument of production, the land, and the apportionment of the same according to the labor capacities of the different families. And we learn that if the communal possession of the land has been destroyed in Western Europe, it was not from within, but from without, by the governments which created a land monopoly in favor of the nobility and the middle classes. We learn, moreover, that the medieval cities succeeded in maintaining in their midst for several centuries in succession a certain socialized organization of production and trade, that these centuries were periods of rapid intellectual, industrial, and artistic progress, and that by the decaying of these communal institutions came mainly from the incapacity of men of combining the village and the city, the peasant with the citizen, so jointly to oppose the growth of the military states which destroyed free cities. The history of mankind, thus understood, does not offer, then, an argument against communism. It appears, on the contrary, as a succession of endeavors to realize some sort of communist organization, endeavors which are crowned with a partial success of a certain duration, and all we are authorized to conclude is that man has not yet found the proper form of combining, on communistic principles, agriculture with a sudden developed industry and rapidly growing international trade. The latter appears especially as a disturbing element, since it is no longer individuals only, or cities that enrich themselves by distant commerce and export, but whole nations grow rich at the cost of these nations which lag behind in their industrial development. These conditions, which began to appear by the end of the 18th century, took, however, their full swing in the 19th century only, after the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, and modern communism had to take them into account. It is now known that the French Revolution, apart from its political significance, was an attempt made by the French people in 1793 and 1794, in three different directions more or less akin to socialism. It was first the equalization of fortunes by means of an income tax and the succession of duties, both heavily progressive, as also by direct confiscation of the land in order to subdivide it, and by the heavy war taxes levied upon the rich only. The second attempt was to introduce a wide national system of rationally established prices of all commodities, for which the real cost of production and moderate trade profits had to be taken into account. The convention worked hard at this scheme, and had nearly completed its work, when reaction took the overhand, and the third was a sort of municipal communism as regards to the consumption of the same objects of first necessity, bought by the municipalities and sold by them at the cost price. It was during this remarkable movement, which has never yet been properly studied, that modern socialism was born. Fourierism with Lange at Lyons, and authoritarian communism with Buonarroti, Babeuf, and their comrades. And it is immediately after the Great Revolution that the three great theoretical founders of modern socialism, Fourier, St. Simon, and Robert Owen, as well as Godwin, the no-state socialism, came forward, while the secret communist societies originated from the Baronati and Babeuf gave their stamp to militant communism for the next 50 years. To be correct, then, we must say that modern socialism is not yet 100 years old, and that for the first half of these 100 years, two nations only, which stood at the head of the industrial movement, i.e. Britain and France, took part in its elaboration, both bleeding at the time from the terrible wounds inflicted upon them by 15 years of Napoleonic wars, both enveloped the great European reaction that had come from the East. In fact, it was only after the Revolution of July 1830 in France that the reform movement of 1830 and through 1832 in England had shaken off that terrible reaction that the discussion of socialism became possible for the next 16 to 18 years, and it was during those years that the aspirations of Fourier, St. Simon, and Robert Owen, worked out by their followers, took a definite shape, and the different schools of socialism which nowadays were defined. In Britain, Robert Owen and his followers worked out their schemes of communist villages, agriculture, and industrial at the same time. Immense cooperative associations were started for creating, with their dividends, more communist colonies, and the great Consolidated Trades Union was founded, the forerunner of the labor parties of our days, and the International Workingmen's Association. In France, the Fourierist Considerant issued his remarkable manifesto, which contains beautifully developed all the theoretical considerations upon the growth of capitalism, which are now described as scientific socialism. Proudhon worked out his idea of anarchism and mutualism with state interference. Louis Blanc published his Organization of Labor, which became later on the program of Lassalle in Germany. Vidal in France and Lawrence Stein in Germany further developed in two remarkable works published in 1846 and 1847 respectively, the theoretical conceptions of Considerant. And finally, Vidal, and especially Pacure, the latter in a very elaborate work, as also in a series of reports, developed in a system of collectivism, which he wanted the Assembly of 1848 to vote in shape of laws. However, there is one feature common to all socialist schemes of the period, which must be noted. The three great founders of socialism who wrote at the dawn of the 19th century were so entranced by the wide horizons which it opened before them that they looked upon it as a new revelation, and upon themselves as the founders of a new religion. Socialism had to be a religion, and they had to regulate its march as the heads of a new church. Besides, writing during the period of reaction which had followed the French Revolution, and seeing more its failures than its successes, They did not trust the masses, and they did not appeal to them for bringing about the changes which they thought necessary. They put their faith, on the contrary, in some great ruler. He would understand the new revelation. He would be convinced of its desirability, but the successful experiments of their phalansteries or associations, and he would peacefully accomplish by the means of his own authority the revolution which would bring well-being and happiness to mankind. A military genius, Napoleon, had just been ruling Europe. Why should not a social genius come forward and carry Europe with him and transfer the new gospel into life? The faith was rooted very deep, and it stood for a long time in the way of socialism. Its traces are ever seen among us down to the present day. It was only during the years of 1848 when the approach of the revolution was felt everywhere, and the proletarians were beginning to plant the banner of socialism on the barricades, with faith in the people began to enter once more into the hearts of the social schemers. Faith on one side in the Republican democracy, and on the other side in free association and the organizing powers of the working men themselves. But then came the revolution of February 1848, the middle-class republic, and with it broken hopes. 4 months only after the proclamation of the republic, the June insurrection of the Paris proletarians broke out, and it was crushed in blood. The wholesale shooting of the working men and the mass deportations to New Guinea, and finally the Napoleonian coup d'etat followed. The socialists were prosecuted with fury, and the weeding out was so terrible and so thorough that for the next 12 to 15 years the very traces of socialism disappeared. Its literature vanished so completely that even names once so familiar before 1848 were entirely forgotten. Ideas which were current, the stock ideas of the socialists before 1848, were wiped out of the memories or taken later on by the present generation for new discoveries.